Okay, good evening. This isn't really my evening, but Edward's, and what I'm going to do is to be a kind of midwife to it. What I'm going to propose to do is that I'm going to talk for 10 or 12 minutes, and then we're going to talk, and eventually I hope we'll all have a chance to talk for a while at the end. So let's just launch into it. I think that we're here ostensibly to talk about this book, After the Last Sky, Edward's new book, with photographs by Jean Moore. But before we do that, I'd like to just introduce Edward as though he needed introducing, judging by the number of people who couldn't get in here. I think to those of us for whom the struggle between Eastern and Western descriptions of the world is an internal struggle as well as an external one, Edward Said has been, for many years now, a centrally important voice. He is, of course, the Parr Professor of English Literature and Comparative Literature at Columbia University in New York, and the author of works of literary criticism on, amongst others, Joseph Conrad. But one of the things that makes Edward so important, I think, is that he reads the world as closely as he reads books. And just briefly to talk about this very important trinity of books that precedes the one we're going to talk about. In Orientalism, he analyzed, to use his own phrase, the affiliation of knowledge with power. This work discusses, if I could really encapsulate it kind of in one sentence, how the scholars of the period of empire helped to create an image of the East which provided a justification for the supremacist ideology of imperialism. This was followed by a question of Palestine, which described the struggle of a primarily Western, or a worldview primarily shaped by Western ideas, that of Zionism and later of Israel, the struggle between that and the largely, as he says, Oriental realities of Arab Palestine. And then came Covering Islam, subtitled How the Media and the Experts Determine How We See the Rest of the World, in which the process of the invention of the East by the West is, so to speak, brought up to date by dealing with the issue of Islamic revival and so forth, the way in which that's been dealt with in the West. The new book, After the Last Sky, the title of the book is taken from a poem by the national poet of Palestine, Mahmoud Darwish, and I'd like to start by reading the poem in the version which Edward uses in the book, which is slightly different from the version that exists in this translation of Darwish's poems. The poem it comes from is called The Earth is Closing on Us. The earth is closing on us, pushing us through the last passage, and we tear off our limbs to pass through. The earth is squeezing us. I wish we were its wheat so that we could die and live again. I wish the earth was our mother so she'd be kind to us. I wish we were pictures on the rocks for our dreams to carry as mirrors. We saw the faces of those to be killed by the last of us in the last defense of the soul. We cried over their children's feast. We saw the faces of those who will throw our children out of the windows of this last space. Our star will hang up mirrors. Where should we go after the last frontiers? Where should the birds fly after the last sky? Where should the plants sleep after the last breath of air? We will write our names with scarlet steam. We will cut off the hand of the song to be finished by our flesh. We will die here in the last passage. Here and here our blood will plant its olive tree. After the last sky, there is no sky. After the last border, there is no land. The first part of Edward's book is called States and is a passionate and very moving meditation on displacement, on landlessness, on exile and identity. He asks, for example, in what sense can Palestinians be said to exist? He says, do we exist? What proof do we have? The further we get from the Palestine of our past, the more precarious our status, the more disrupted our being, the more intermittent our presence. When did we become a people? When did we stop being one? or are we in the process of becoming one? What do those big questions have to do with our intimate relationships with each other and with others? We frequently end our letters with the mottos Palestinian love or Palestinian kisses. Are there really such things as Palestinian intimacy and embraces, or are they simply intimacy and embraces, experiences common to everyone, neither politically significant nor particular to a nation or a people? One of the things that I'd very much like to discuss is an idea in the book about the meaning of the Palestinian experience for the form of works of art made by Palestinians. What Edward says or suggests is that the discontinuity, the broken nature of Palestinian experience means that classic rules about forms, about structure, cannot be true to that experience, and that since the essential fact is instability, what one needs to do is to work through a kind of chaos, a kind of unstable form, and that those are the things which express the Palestinian experience most accurately. It goes on, proceeds then to introduce a theme which develops later in the book, the theme of the insider and the outsider. It's fairly straightforward to say that one of the ways of describing what has happened in Palestine is that the insider, that's to say the Palestinian Arab, has had his, by what's happened in the history of the region, has been turned into an outsider. There's a meditation on a photograph in the book, a photograph of Nazareth, which is taken from a position of what's called Upper Nazareth, an area which didn't exist in the time of Arab Palestine, but which is now the point of view of the photograph. So what happens is that Arab Palestine is seen from the point of view of a new invented Palestine, and the inside experience of old Arab Palestine has now become the external experience of the photograph. However, as he points out, the Palestinians have remained, and he quotes, I'll quote a little bit of as well, a poem by Tawfiq Zayad called The 20 Impossibles, in which he says, "It would be easier to catch fried fish in the Milky Way, to plow the sea, or to teach the alligator speech than to make us leave." In part 2, Interiors, this idea of the insider and its meaning is developed to a much greater degree. One interesting thing is that Edward talks about a change in the status of the Palestinians who are inside Palestine. That you say that until recently there was amongst the Palestinian community in general a slight discounting of those Palestinians who remained inside as being somehow contaminated or polluted by the proximity of the Jews. Now, however, they've acquired that this situation has been inverted, and that because they are there, because they're there maintaining a Palestinian culture, obliging the world to see that Palestinians are there, they have acquired a greater status that, in the eyes of other Palestinians. So there's a kind of reversal there in the Palestinian perception of those who have remained. He also talks very interestingly about the inside, this experience of being inside Palestinianness, as a series of codes which are incomprehensible to outsiders, but which all Palestinians who meet instantly are able to communicate to each other. And that the only way you can show your insiderness is through the expression of certain of these codes. There's a very funny incident about a letter that you received from somebody who is a karate expert, which perhaps we can talk about later on. Karate as a means of describing identity. There is, he says, amongst Palestinians, this kind of cult of physical strength. I'll read this, actually. It's very funny. Yes, Edward gets this letter, which is carried to him by somebody he didn't know. And the letter is all about how the writer of the letter is a karate expert and has represented the Palestinians in karate championships internationally. So Edward says, after all, what was the message to me? I'll just read little bits of this. First of all, he says, he was inside and using the good offices of a sympathetic outsider to contact me, an insider who was now outside Jerusalem, the place of our common origin. That he wrote my name in English was as much a sign that he too could deal with the world I lived in as it was that he followed what I did. The time had come to demonstrate that the Edward Saids had better remember that we were being watched by karate experts. I said, karate does not stand for self-development, but only, this is the idea of repetition as a way of describing identity is very important, I think, in the book. It says, karate does not stand for self-development, but only for the repeated act of being a Palestinian karate expert. A Palestinian, it is as if the activity of repeating prevents us and others from skipping us or overlooking us entirely. He then gives a number of other examples of repetition, of repeating the behavior in order to make it Palestinian behavior, and thus existing through that repetition. There's also, seems to be a compulsion to excess, of which there are various examples, both tragic and comic, in the book. It then goes on to describe the process, the idea of the interior through invasions of it. That one of the problems of being Palestinian is that the idea of the interior is regularly invaded by other people's descriptions, by other people's attempts to control what it is to occupy that space, whether it is by Jordanian Arabs who say there is no difference between a Jordanian and a Palestinian, or by Israelis who claim that the land is not Palestine but Israel. It then goes on, and I think we should talk about this in a question later, to talk about the exclusion of women from most descriptions. And there's a very moving passage where you talk about a film in which the experience of two women is contrasted. And perhaps we could discuss that in a while. In the third part, which is called Emergence, and in the fourth part, which is called Past and Future, there is a discussion. The discussion moves really from this kind of very passionate and emotive, or certainly moving writing, towards a discussion of what might happen now, really, and what it is to be a Palestinian now, and what it might be. He talks about Zionism, and I think this is a central issue which he also has talked about in an earlier book, The Question of Palestine, the way in which it is very difficult to make any kind of critique of Zionism without instantly having the charge of anti-Semitism leveled against one, and the way in which it becomes important to understand Zionism as a historical process, as existing in a context, and as having certain historical functions. And I think I'd like to ask about that. The important idea, I think, that exile, that we have all in the West come to think of exile as a primarily literary and bourgeois state, that the people who are exiles are Joyce, and so forth, that exile is a situation from which great thoughts are thought, and which is essentially a middle-class phenomenon. But in the case of the Palestinians, he points out exile is a mass phenomenon. It is the mass that is exiled and not the bourgeoisie, and that this alters the notion of what exile is. There is then a series of questions which come back to the initial question of do we exist, which is what happens to landless people? How do you exist in the world? What do you preserve of yourselves? What do you abandon? You describe yourself in an idea which I find very valuable and connects with many things I've been thinking about, as hybrids, as existing. Find it. You say our truest reality is expressed in the way we cross over from one place to another. We are migrants and perhaps hybrids in but not of any situation in which we find ourselves. This is the deepest continuity of our lives as a nation in exile and constantly on the move. You make a criticism of the way in which Palestine, or the Palestinian cause has been so closely, or has been so to such an extent concentrated on its military expression, and you talk about the dangers for that for Palestinians, the fact that the cultural loss, the cultural absences in Palestinianness. So I mean, if do you feel that's a fair summary? I mean, yes, all right. If not, speak now. So I'd like to stop talking at this point by asking a question. Some of you may know that Edward recently received threats against his safety in America from the Jewish Defense League. And I think that's an important piece of context to know that to be a Palestinian, or in many ways to be the Palestinian in New York, is not the easiest of fates. When I'm going to tell two stories, one comic and one tragic, and then ask Edward to talk about how it feels to be a Palestinian in New York. The comic one is one of my sisters who was in California, was repeatedly asked where she came from, and when she said Pakistan, people usually didn't know. At one point, she told somebody that she came from Pakistan, and the American said, "Oh yes, Pakistan," and immediately started talking about his Jewish friends. I think it's impossible to overestimate the influence of American ignorance on world affairs. The less comic story is that in January, when I was at the Penn Congress in New York, the American writer Cynthia Ozick took it upon herself to assemble a petition, which we were all supposed to sign, which called Chancellor Kreisky of Austria, a man who is himself a Jew, a man who has given refuge to tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of Jews for leaving the Soviet Union, to call him an anti-Semite. Why? Because he had had a conversation with Yasser Arafat. What was alarming about what ought to be, on the face of it, an absurd request, was that a lot of people signed this petition and that it was taken extremely seriously at the Penn Congress. In fact, there was a moment at which I felt nervously that since nobody else in the room seemed to be speaking about Palestine, I might have to. But the defense came, of all places, from Pierre Trudeau, who spoke really very movingly in defense of the Palestinian cause. But I mean, these are some of the extraordinary things that happen in New York. Edward, I mean, you're the man on the spot. I wondered if it's getting worse or better and how it feels.
No, I think it's getting worse because they're crazy. You know, the impression one has is of a kind of ground. Most people who feel strongly about Palestine and Palestinians in New York have had no experience of it at all. I mean, they think of it as essentially what they see on television. What they see on television is bomb throwers and murderers and what is called terrorists, and by the Secretary of State and others. Therefore, you get this, what seems to me to be a kind of groundless passion, you know. At the same time, which is interesting, there's a great deal of curiosity. I mean, when I'm introduced to somebody who may have heard of me or knows something about me, there's a very strange kind of approach to me, which suggests, well, you know, maybe you're not as bad as you seem, or something of that sort. And the fact that I speak English and you know, do it reasonably well, and it adds to the, and it becomes very complicated. So most people then tend to just drop one aspect entirely and concentrate on the fact that I'm a professor of English and do those kinds of things. But the violence that one feels around one is really quite new, I think. I mean, I think, as this book is, in a way, it's a consequence of 1982. I mean, I think there was a sense in which some important break with the past occurred, both for people who are supporters of Israel in the United States and for people like us, I mean, for whom, you know, the destruction of Beirut, so to speak, our Beirut, was the end of an era. And I think for the most part, you know, it's a kind of double existence that one has to live. You feel that you're leading a kind of normal life, but every so often you're brought up against a threat or you know, a kind of an allusion to something that's deeply unpleasant and something like that. But you always feel outside in some way.
Has there been any alteration in your ability to publish or to talk about the Palestinian issue?
To some extent, yes, I think it's true, but it's not, yes, because I think the Palestinian issue is the one issue on which, you know, the sort of the left and the right break in America in a way. And the number of people who are publicly willing to talk about it, as you mentioned at the Penn conference, I mean, is very small. I mean, there are a few groups, I mean, a few people. Chomsky is one, for instance. Alexander Coburn is another person. But most people tend to think, well, it's better left to the crazies. So I think it's there are fewer places that are hospitable to one, yes. And the result is that you tend to publish in to a smaller audience. But ironically, you also become tokenized. So whenever there's some incident, as there has been in the last year, you know, having to do with a hijacking or an outrage of one sort, I always get phone calls from the media saying, would you come and comment, and so on and so forth. So that's a very strange thing. I mean, you're used always as a kind of representative of terrorism.
Yes, it's an extraordinary thing that you should know so much. I mean, there should be an assumption that you should know so much about.
I mean, you're treated like a diplomat of terrorism. You know, I mean, there's you know, you're given a place at the table, etc. Except once when I about 9 months ago, I took my young son, who is a very alert boy and very different from his sister, who has suppressed the fact of her, in a certain sense. She's only 12. It's very hard for her to deal with her background, or at least her parents' background, so she doesn't talk about it at all. But my son is very interested in this whole thing, and he's, you know, been with me to Jordan when we went to the National Council in 1984. And he's two people. He adopts the accent. He takes on the accent of a Palestinian speaking English, a rather heavy Arabic accent like that. And he calls himself something different. He's Wadia Saeed with a kind of American accent on the one hand, but then he calls me Doctor in Arabic, which means doctor. And he treats me with a kind of ironic veneration. And so he came with me once to this television interview where I was to supposedly debate the Israeli ambassador about, I forget what incident it was. It may have been Achille Laura or something. And then I found the most extraordinary thing, that not only would he not sit in the same room with me, he wanted to be in a different building so as not to be sort of contaminated. And then when the interviewer said to the national audience, you know, Professor Saeed and Ambassador Netanyahu refused to speak to each other. The Israeli ambassador won't speak to him, and he, you know, I interrupted. I said, no, I'm perfectly willing to speak to him, but he wants it. Yeah. So the moderator said, well, I stand corrected. And then he said, Mr. Ambassador, why won't you speak to Professor Saeed? He said, because he wants to kill me. And and the moderator, without batting an eyelash, said, oh, really? Tell us about it. And then he went on about how Palestinians want to kill the Israelis. And I mean, there wasn't any sense in which the whole thing was totally absurd. So in that respect, it's a very odd situation. You're constantly having to make sort of adjustments to these. And you have to become more than one character.
Yes. Well, let me then ask the opposite of that question, which is, how is it to be a New York Palestinian in Palestine?
Well, it's sort of strange. I think I sometimes feel I'm the only Palestinian in New York, you know. I mean, because there aren't, first of all, there just aren't that many Palestinians in New York. And amongst Palestinians, I think they probably think of me as some kind of freak, which I probably am. I mean, I think, you know, there is something peculiar about leading the kind of life I do.
Freaks are all right.
There are, yeah, I mean, I'm for them. You know, yes, I guess you are too.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we form a kind of freaks union.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And that I persist in this kind of crazy New York existence where nobody feels at home, really, except probably me, is very strange. But the important thing to remember is that I haven't been to Palestine, you know, really at all since the middle 60s. And in the last 4 years, really, since '82, I haven't really been to many parts of the Arab world, so that there's a sense of exclusion. And I think what is interesting is that many of us who are in this peculiar condition are beginning to form a different kind of community, which is not based on everyday experience, but based on telephones and certain kinds of activities that occur infrequently. So it's a strange and marginal kind of existence because there's no center to it.
You say you don't like calling it a Palestinian diaspora. Why is that?
Well, because it suggests, you know, that I don't really know. Why don't I like to call it that? Well, I mean, the one thing I think that many of us, I think, are sort of not exactly pushed into, but there's a sense in which we have become, as this man in the note from Jerusalem wrote, he says, you know, we are the Jews of the Arab world. And there's a kind of parallelism there that I think our experience is quite different. It doesn't have quite the dimension. It's a much more modest experience, perhaps. And I think the idea that there is a kind of redemptive homeland is to me, it doesn't sort of answer to my view of the thing.
So then let me ask you your question then. Do we exist? I mean, do you exist, and what proof do you have? I mean, that's to say, in what sense is there a Palestinian nation? What is it, if it exists?
Well, it exists in the sense that a lot of people have memories. You know, there's a tremendous amount of interest now in recording the past and looking into the past for signs of a kind of coherent community which had been buried. Interesting. A lot of Palestinians are now trying to de-Arabize Palestine. In other words, to detach it from the general Arab context in which it's always been. You know, since the middle 30s, it became an Arab problem. But a lot of, you know, Palestinian scholars of a younger generation are interested in looking back to Palestinian history and trying to discover things about the Palestinian political and cultural experience that were different from the other Arab experiences of that sort. So there's that. There's also the sense in which it's a community which does strange things which other communities don't do. Associations. The replications of Palestinian organizations in places as peculiar to us, I'm sorry, I hope I'm not offending anyone here, as Australia and South America are really quite remarkable. You find that people who will live, or will come to America, who will live in Youngstown, let's say Ohio, which is, I've never been there, but I mean, you can imagine what it's like, okay? And will know everything that's going on, I mean, during the days of Beirut, will know everything that's going on about the difference between the latest disagreement between the Popular Front and Fatah and so on, and will not even know the name of the mayor of Youngstown, or how he's elected, if he's elected. I mean, you know, they will assume that he was put there by somebody. So there's that peculiar kind of existence. And then all Palestinians move a lot. You get that impression, that there's a lot of carrying, like in those pictures of Jean, carrying bags and moving from one place to the other. I mean, in that respect, I think we're a people. We're a people. And we say it loudly enough, and repetitiously enough, and stridently enough.
Yes.
And above all, they haven't been able to get rid of us. I mean, that is the great feeling that I would say the positive or pessimistic feeling, is that you wake up in the morning and you say, well, they didn't bump me off.
Yes.
You know?
I wondered if you'd just like to talk a bit about what you say in the book about these kind of codes by which Palestinians exist and recognize each other. The idea of repetition as a way of existing, the idea of excess as a way of existing, because I think that's a very interesting thing.
Well, yes. One of the things is, of course, that like so many things, many of them, I mean, so many so-called traditions, they're invented. You know. Yeah. So, that, for example, I had a very close friend of mine, who came to my house and stayed over. And in the morning, we had breakfast. And we have, I suppose it's true throughout the Arab world generally, but certainly in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, there's a herb that we have with our morning lebni, which is a yogurt cheese, called za'atar. And so we had the lebni, and we put some of the za'atar on it. And he said, "You have za'atar?" I said, "Yes." I said, "We always have." "You see, it's a sign of a Palestinian home that it's got za'atar in it." Well, I mean, I don't know if it is or not, but there's yes, of course. And then he went on and expatiated at great and tedious length on Palestinian cuisine, which is very much like, of course, Lebanese cuisine and Syrian cuisine. But by the end of the morning, we were both convinced that we had a totally distinct but it was too much. You know, there was too much of that. So there's that.
Because a Palestinian chooses to do something, it becomes a Palestinian thing to do.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. That's the comic side of it, of course, yes. But I mean, it's there all the time, and you want. But the interesting thing is that the way people talk about the current situation frequently. I mean, it may arise later, as a matter of fact. The way people ask you a question, you can frequently tell. If a Palestinian asks you a political question, you can usually tell what current or what deviation or what camp or what group he or she comes from. And it's the choice of words, you see. I'll give you a simple example. The Popular Front, for example, people who believe in the complete liberation of Palestine, speak differently about liberation than people who believe in a negotiated settlement a la Fatah or Arafat. The enemies of Arafat within Fatah speak in using different code words. And so you can immediately tell, you know, by talking to somebody where he or she sort of comes from and what his or her ideas are. Then there are accents. I mean, the regional accents. It's very strange to meet a Palestinian kid, for example, in Lebanon, who has never been to Palestine, but was born in Lebanon in some refugee camp, but who carries the inflections of Haifa or Jaffa in his Lebanese Arabic. In that way, it continues in a kind of insistent and some people think, for example, that the Lebanese accent that the Palestinian accent is an especially ugly one, and it's as are many Palestinian names. They tend to have a kind of grating, rather overstressed sound to them. And that they're handed on generation after generation is quite remarkable, I think. In this way, you know, you assert yourself.
The idea of excess, you talk about how you find yourself obliged to carry too much luggage wherever you go. I thought it was very impressive that the the dialogue between the Israeli broadcaster and the
that's a fantastic piece,
captured Palestinian guerrilla,
yes,
in which what seems to be happening is that the guerrilla is confessing to terrible crimes and implicating himself. I mean, what's in fact happening is that he is sending up the entire event by a colossal excess of apology, which the Israeli broadcaster is too tuned in to his own sort of attitudes to see that he's being sent up. See, so I read a sort of brief extract from this. What the broadcaster said, what was your mission in South Lebanon?
Salman, may I just set the scene a bit? Because I mean, it's sort of interesting that what this was.
So you read it.
Oh, yeah, okay. What happened was in '82, when Lebanon was, South Lebanon in particular, was invaded, they captured, I wasn't there at the time, but I found this out afterwards, that what they would do, or the Israeli broadcasters, through the army obviously would pick up these people and then put them on the radio and interrogate them. So as to sort of, well, it was a form of psychological warfare, obviously, to interrogate them and to discourage other Palestinians from resisting, and to show how a Palestinian was confessing to the most heinous crimes. So since they were all terrorists, this man knew that he had to play the role of a terrorist to the Israeli interrogator. Now, the interesting thing is that when it was presented by the Israelis, it was an instance of terrorism, and here's this man demonstrating a kind of textbook case of terrorism. In Beirut, one of the ways I got this is that a cassette recording of this was made and played over in the evening as a way of entertaining people. How this Palestinian sort of putting on the Israeli interrogator. So, I mean, I'll translate some of the Arabic stuff in it. Israeli broadcaster, your name, captured Palestinian guerrilla. My name is Ahmad Abdul Hamid Abu Sitti. What's your movement name? My movement name is Abu Layl, which in Arabic, in English means father of night. I mean, a rather threatening, kind of horrible sound to it. Tell me, Mr. Abu Layl, to which terrorist organization do you belong? I belong to the Popular Front for the Liberation, in Arabic he says, Jabha Sha'biyya al-Tahrir. Then he interrupts himself, he says, I mean, Azdi Takhrib. I mean, terrorization of Palestine. And when did you get involved in a terrorist organization? When I first became aware of terrorism. And what was your mission in South Lebanon? My mission was terrorism. In other words, we would enter villages and just terrorize. يعني منخش على الضياع ومنخرب in Arabic. And whenever there were women and children in particular, we would terrorize. Everything and all we did was terrorism. And did you practice terrorism out of belief in a cause or simply for money? No, just for money. What kind of cause is this anyway? Why, is there still a cause? We sold out a long time ago. Tell me, where do the terrorist organizations get their money? From anyone who has spare money for terrorism. In other words, from the Arab regime. I mean, it's incredible that that the Israeli, well, it goes on. I mean, it's obviously too long, but anyway. What's your opinion of the terrorist Arafat? I swear that he's the greatest terrorist of all. He's the one who sold us and the cause out. His whole life is terrorism. Of course, to a Palestinian, this could mean that he's the most committed of all Palestinians, you see, but it sounds as if he's a total sellout. What's your opinion of the way the Israeli Defense Forces have conducted themselves? On my honor, we thank the Israeli Defense Forces for their good treatment to each terrorist. Do you have any advice for other terrorists who are still terrorizing and attacking the IDF? My advice to them is to surrender their arms to the IDF, and what they'll find there is the best possible treatment. Lastly, Mr. Terrorist, would you like, would you like to send a message to your family? I'd like to assure my family and friends that I'm in good health, and I'd also like to thank the enemy the enemy broadcasting facility for letting me speak out like this. You mean the Call Israel? The voice of Israel. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes, of course. Unnaturally, sir. It's a great passage.
And this ran. I mean, this was out on air, straight.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Put out, you know, on a daily basis, and then recorded in Beirut and played back to the boys who would make fun of it. Obviously, I think it's a great funny thing.
One thing you say about repetition, about the problem of being Palestinian, is the need endlessly to retell the story from the beginning. And you talk about an article in a fashion magazine under the headline "Terrorist Couture," which is a kind of photo article about Palestinian dresses. this headline, which makes a number of claims. First of all, claims that they're not really Palestinian, that they're Arab dresses which the Palestinians have somehow hijacked. I may use that verb.
Right. Go right ahead. We do it all the time.
Also that they're essentially rich people's dresses,
right.
that they're not dresses of the people, they're haute bourgeois dresses.
Yes, upper middle class, she says, yes. Right.
Sorry, she's an American. She doesn't know French.
She doesn't know French.
She's called Sharon Churcher, and
right.
as you say in the book, in the larger scheme of things, who is Sharon Churcher? And she's somebody, doing a hack job on a hack fashion magazine. And yet, Edward says he feels the need to go right back to the beginning and to say these are Palestinian dresses, they are not upper middle class dresses, and to explain the whole history of Palestine in order to unmake the lie of Sharon Churcher. And that problem of repetition, that you have to go back and tell the story from the beginning every time because so many lies have intervened. Does that get tiring? I mean,
it does. You find yourself having to do it every single time, and but you do it anyway. I mean, it's like it's like trying to find the magical moment where everything starts, as in Midnight's Children, midnight. So you go back, but it's very hard to do that because you have to work out everything, and get past a lot of information that's there in the daily press. Why don't Palestinians just stay where they are? Why are they such troublemakers? That immediately launches you into a tremendous sort of harangue about, really our history was this, and we were there. And I tell people, my mother was born in Nazareth, my father was born in Jerusalem, and I'm bored by the whole story. Yes. But you feel you have to do it. And the interesting thing is, that there seems to be nothing sort of in the world that sustains the story, that keeps it there. In other words, unless you're telling it, it's just going to drop and disappear. Sort of,
so
like Scheherazade.
So it needs to be perpetually told in order to exist.
Yeah, exactly. In order to be, whereas you feel that the other narratives are there and they're kind of permanent and they're, they have a kind of institutional existence, and you have to just try and work away at them.
Perhaps we could come to the point that I just touched on, that you make at some length in the book, about the unheard voices of Palestinian women. I'll just briefly quote from the book. If I can find it. There we are. It says, yet I recognize in all this a fundamental problem, the crucial absence of women. With few exceptions, women seem to have played little more than the role of hyphen, connective, transition, mere incident. Unless we are able to perceive at the interior of our life the statements women make, concrete, watchful, compassionate, immensely poignant, strangely invulnerable, we will never fully understand our experience of dispossession. And then you illustrate this, primarily, not only, but with the description of a film, The Fertile Memory, by the young Palestinian director Michel Khlefi, which deals with the experience of two Palestinian women. Perhaps you could say.
Yes, it's a film I think that's been probably shown here. It made a very strong impression on me. I don't know if it's a technically very proficient or perfect film, but it's about two women, an older woman who is, I found out later from Khlefi himself, his aunt, who works in a bathing suit factory. She's from Nazareth. She works in an Israeli bathing suit factory, and she's shown in the film sort of doing some sewing and then taking care of a grandson, and she's a widow. And the other woman in the film is quite a well-known Palestinian novelist from Nablus called Sahar Khalifi, whom some of you may know. Some of her work has just been translated into English. But the film is a kind of interweaving of the lives of these two women with interviews. And the most striking scene in the film, I think, is when this woman, Farah Hatoum, the older woman, his aunt, is talked to by her son and daughter-in-law, or maybe it's her daughter and her son-in-law, because she has a piece of property that is now lived on by a Jewish family, and it's in effect owned by them. And Nazareth, of course, is in Israel, not on the occupied territories. And they come to her with news that the people who've been living on this land ever since she's known now want to sell the land. And would she sell it to them because they want legal title to it? And she refuses. She's not interested. So they said, well, what do you mean? I mean, they're living on it. It's their land. And now, to make things easier for you, they want to give you money for it, on condition, of course, that you give them the title deed to the land. And she says, no, I won't do that. So then, I mean, it's a totally irrational position, and Khalifi in the film registers the expression on her face, which is a combination of not only stubbornness, but a kind of almost transcendent, maybe foolishness. I mean, that here's an opportunity to get some money. She's a poor woman. And then she says, in Arabic, she says, Min bi'arif, she says in Arabic. I mean, who knows? I don't have the land now, but who knows what will happen? We were here first, then the Jews came, and others will come after them. I own the land, I'll die. But it will stay there despite all the comings and goings of people. And they cannot budge her. Then there's this quite amazing thing where, how it happened, I don't understand, but she's then taken to see her land. I mean, she's never actually been there because her husband and she were separated during the events of 1948, and he went to Lebanon and he died. And he left her this piece of land, and she never saw it, she never lived on it, it's outside Nazareth. And Khalifi actually records her first experience of the land that she owns but doesn't own. She just has a title deed on it. She walks on the land, she sort of steps gently, and she turns around like that, and there's this quite extraordinary expression on her face that I'm on my land for the first time. And then, of course, the expression changes when she realizes what an absurdity the whole thing is, and she sort of turns around and walks away. But you get this, I mean, in some way, it made an impression that, in a subliminal manner, that sort of typified for me somehow the persistent presence of the woman in Palestinian life and the unacknowledged, the lack of acknowledgement that we've had in all kinds of ways of this extraordinary phenomenon, which I don't completely understand. And there was another experience like that when I was showing somebody a picture of this, of one of the women in the book, actually, a Palestinian friend of mine, and he then commented, because I feel that there's a very strong misogynist streak in Arab society. I mean, there's a kind of respect and admiration, and yet fear and dislike of the woman for her particular kind of strength, which Farah Hatoum in the film exemplifies. And I remember showing, as I say, a picture of, I hope I can find it quickly so that I'm not, of this rather large and quite formidable but yet happy-looking Palestinian woman standing there with her arms across her chest. And a friend of mine who, you know, I respect, and I can't find the picture, I'm terribly sorry, but said to me, you know, there's the Palestinian woman in all her strength, and then he added, and ugliness. And it seemed to me, here, this picture, which I thought is a quite remarkable picture by Jean Moore, but it seems to say something that we haven't really been able to find ways of touching on. And that whole experience is something that I, as a man in this Palestinian sort of mess, I'm beginning to sort of try to articulate.
I wanted to ask, I suppose we ought to touch on the subject of Zionism and the problem of combating it. And you say, for one thing, what's interesting about your book is how fair you are. Because you talk about how, having lived inside Western culture for a long time, you say you understand as well as any non-Jew can hope to do what is the power of Zionism for the Jewish people. And also, in many ways, you describe it as being a program more efficient, more in detailed terms competent than anything that Palestinians have been able to put up against it. That it's been this, what's the phrase, a goat and another acre. That it was a process of slow and steady acquisition, which was very planned, very efficient, and very competent, and you give it credit for that. The problem is that any attempt to provide a critique of Zionism is almost always faced with, these days particularly, with the charge that it's anti-Semitism in disguise. That the line that you are not anti-Semitic but anti-Zionist is always or often greeted with the response, oh yes, yeah, well, as though to say, we know that code, you know? Whereas I think in the question of Palestine, your earlier book, and again in this one, you do provide the basis for a very useful and kind of emotionally neutral critique of Zionism, which is as a historical phenomenon, where it came from and what it's for. And I think it might be worth just for a few minutes talking about that.
Well, I feel that the question of Zionism is perhaps the touchstone, really, for kind of political judgment. That is to say, a lot of people who are very happy to talk about apartheid and attack it, and talk about American intervention in Central America and attack that, so on. I mean, there are a whole set of things of that sort, are unwilling to touch on the question of Palestine and the matter of Zionism and what Zionism did to the Palestinians. I think principally because, you know, it's very hard, and I can understand it perfectly, I think, or almost perfectly, to be the victim of a victim. I mean, that is to say, if you're trying to deal with a classic victim of all time, the Jew and his or her movement, then to present yourself as the victim of that is really, I mean, it's comedy worthy of your writing. I mean, it's an untenable position. There's that problem. But there's now something new, and that is that I think, you know, there's a whole spate of books and articles coming out now in which anti-Semitism is really made the umbrella for any form of criticism of Israel. It's particularly true in the United States, but that is the going concern now. And as a result, if you say almost anything, you are now shown to be really, for the first time in history, as an Arab and from a Muslim culture, joining classical European or Western anti-Semitism. I mean, this is the great move. So the relationship between Zionism and critiques of Zionism is now almost like a chess game. I mean, if you want to talk about it, you've got to be able to talk about it in a way without touching on these other things and dragging in these extraneous things and say, look, this is specifically from the point of view of the Palestinian what Zionism has done, and it has a context, it has a history, and it is particular and concrete in this way. But that's very hard for people to attend to, given, as I said earlier, the absence of a narrative, given the absence of a kind of a presence there that has the force that you would like. But I think one has to do it anyway. I mean, one has to be able to do it and to tell the truth, which is not so easy.
You said that there's a kind of basic, so to speak, sleight of hand that Zionism works,
yes,
which is the idea that it is somehow outside history and objective, and that it is not. It's not a phenomenon that exists in a context, but it is somehow absolute.
Absolutely.
And that the problem is to make people see it as being like anything else in history. That's to say, arising from sources and going somewhere. Do you think that Zionism has changed in its nature in recent years? I mean, apart from the fact that it's become harder to criticize it, you say, has there actually been any alteration in the nature of the...
Well, I'm speaking, of course, about America. I mean,
yes,
it may be different here.
Zionism.
I have the impression, you know, that it's easier, I mean, to talk about Palestine and Zionism in this context, say, than it is in the United States. But I think, yes, I mean, there are changes. I mean, I talk about this in the book because, I mean, one of the things I'm really interested in is the extent to which people are not bound by and not sort of frozen in attitudes of perpetual sort of difference and hostility to each other. I mean, there are a lot of Jews that I've encountered over the last 10 years, for example, who are very interested in some kind of exchange. And the whole notion of crossing over, of moving from one sort of identity to the other is terribly important to me. Yeah. I mean, being as I am, as we all are, sort of hybrid people in any way, in any event. So that kind of thing is an important change within it. And I think, you know, the events of the last 4 or 5 years has created a rather large community of Jews who are not as comfortable with the idea of the absolutes of Zionism, I think. And that's terribly important.
Okay, I just want to ask you a couple more questions before opening it out. One question is a little question, really. It's to do with your... these are more personal questions. They're to do with your experience of being a minority inside a minority. I mean, you say that, you know, to be a Palestinian is basically to come from Muslim culture.
Right.
And yet you're not a Muslim. And I wondered if that was a problem inside Palestinianness, if there's a difference between being a Muslim Palestinian and non-Muslim Palestinian, and if there are any historical frictions there.
Not in my experience.
No.
I mean, there may be, but I mean, I've never myself experienced it, and you know, it may be an unusual thing. But my sense of it is that, unlike, say, the Lebanese experience, which has infected a lot of people, where people now begin to feel the difference between sects and Sunni and Shia and Maronite and Orthodox and so on and so forth, that hasn't been the experience at this distant remove that I've lived it,
Yeah.
of the Palestinian community. But on the other hand, I think that it's true to say that even in the Arab world, every Palestinian, I mean, if one were to try to think of something particularly good in a certain way about the problems of being a Palestinian, or you might say, what are the virtues of it, or the pleasures of it, okay, is that it teaches one to feel one's own sort of particularity as not so much only as a problem, but as a kind of gift in a way. And I think more and more Palestinians feel that. In other words, whether in the Arab world or elsewhere, we're sort of set apart, and it gives us a kind of an aura, if you like, of specialness,
Yeah.
which is not the specialness of sanctity or anything of that sort, but it allows, I think, people to experience their own particularity in a new way. I mean, especially because one has the feeling in the Arab world and elsewhere that this mass society has destroyed identity in so powerful a way that the sense of particularity is something worth keeping, I think.
You say the vast majority of our people are now thoroughly sick of the misfortunes that have befallen us, partly through our own fault, partly because of who our dispossessors are, and partly because our cause has a singular ineffectuality to it, capable neither of sufficiently mobilizing our friends nor of overcoming our enemies. On the other hand, I have never met a Palestinian who is tired enough of being a Palestinian to give up entirely.
Yes.
I wanted to use
That's
that.
well put, actually. I'd rather like that.
Yeah, it's not bad. He's got an interesting writer, this chap. It seems to me that this book represents a shift in your writing. I mean, for those of us who've been following your writing, that, well, obviously it's a much more personal book than the earlier books. The center of the previous three books in its various forms was to do with the dispute between Eastern and Western culture, as I was saying earlier, and as you've said. Now that dispute is obviously still there in these pages, but it's not the center of the process anymore. It seems to be the dispute in this book is much more an inner dispute, a kind of inner dialectic inside the heart of Palestinianness, of what it is to be a Palestinian. You also say it's a kind of turning inwards, and you say in the book that you have the sense that many Palestinians these days are experiencing that kind of a turning inward rather than after a period of being out. And I wondered, just as a last thing before we ask the audience to join in, what you could say about that and why that's happening and what your experience of that has been.
Well, I mean, I think obviously a lot of it has to do with disillusion. I mean, you know, most people of my generation, I can't really speak for the younger people because their experiences are quite different, but most people of my generation grew up in, of course, an atmosphere of despondency and so on, but also, beginning in the late 60s and early 70s, of tremendous, I mean, it's hard to recall the sort of romantic, almost glamour and enthusiasm that greeted the rise of this movement, which rose, in fact, out of the ashes, if you like, but in a curious sort of way accomplished materially. I mean, you know, very little. I mean, no land was liberated, you know, during this entire period. And there was a sense in which the experience and the excitement of the Palestinian resistance, as it was called in those days, was a very heady atmosphere. And it was part of Arab nationalism. I think, you know, and it was part of, later became, alas, in an ironic and extraordinarily contradictory way, it became part of the Arab oil boom, strangely. Well, all of that is beginning to crumble. I mean, the dismantling is occurring all across, I mean, right in front of our eyes. And the period of disillusionment and questioning and was it worth it and where do we go now, I think is really very much the mood in which I wrote this book. And I felt also that the need, I mean, the importance of, to me at least, the photographs and the pictures in this was that important to see it not just as a personal thing, in other words, not only through our own kind of hermetic, you know, disillusionment with going nowhere, but also because we have in fact become a kind of public, as a people, we've become a public possession. I mean, the Palestinians are a kind of commodity after all. I mean, they're useful for many things, among others to explain terrorism. And I found myself writing now also from the position of somebody who really has, to me at least, at last sort of connected these different parts of myself, the part that was a professor of English and did that kind of thing, with the part that lived in a small way the life of Palestine. So I think the mode was an attempt to register that not because it's particularly important, but because it seems to me in some strange way unusual and interesting.
Okay. Well, it's your turn. Well, as usual, I'd be grateful if people could stand up, perhaps if you could say who you are, and if you could ask questions rather than have things which don't have question marks at the end.
Declarations.
And we don't have that much time, so let's start. And if nobody wants to ask the first question, could you ask the second question, please?
There's somebody over there.
Somebody over there? Yes.
If and when you're invited to speak to Jewish audiences, what do you tell them about the future of Jews in Palestine?
My goodness, what a powerful question that is. I think that it's difficult for me to talk about the future of another people who feels themselves, for the most part, to be different from the Arab Palestinian. But I think that to my interpretation of it, at least, the Palestinian experience is, for all of its shabbiness in places and its ineffectualness and its failures and so on, it's a struggle to try to achieve a mode of somehow of coexistence of some sort, and in particular, because I think in an extraordinarily powerful way, there is a bond between the Israeli and the Palestinian now, which has been formed over a generation. Now it's based, it seems to me, on fear. I must tell you this, Uri. I was at a conference about 3 months ago, and there was a discussion between 6 Palestinians, 6 Israelis. And one of the questions asked, it was one of these sort of political psychology conferences. It was called, in fact, the International Society for Political Psychology. I don't know what I was doing there, but anyway, we were sort of experiments in how Israelis and Palestinians might speak to each other. And the question for the second half of the meeting was, what are the psychological obstacles to peace? And I was fascinated by the fact that the Israelis, who for the most part, in what they had said in the morning and during the most of the afternoon, seemed very relaxed and were able to talk academically. The Palestinians, myself including, were arguing and passionate, and there was a kind of tremendous urgency to what we were saying. I mean, after all, we all felt, as Palestinians, that these are the people who were able to talk academically because they held the land, they were in charge and everything. So we came to this point finally when the moderator said, well, all right, now I want to ask the Israelis, what are the psychological obstacles to peace? And one of them said, I mean, it almost floored me. He said, we are afraid of the Palestinians. I couldn't understand it. I mean, I didn't know what he was talking about. I mean, here they controlled everything. You know, we were a kind of disadvantaged minority in our own country. And yet they had this extraordinary fixation upon the Palestinian, and the PLO in particular. And this person, who's a very serious scholar and military sort of person, I mean, he's got involvements in the government and the army, then went on to say that we're more afraid of the PLO than we are of all of the Arab armies. And I couldn't understand it, except that there was he was expressing in some inadvertent way, some peculiar bond between him and us that we're only beginning now to try to understand. But I mean, that he should say we're more afraid of the PLO than all of the other Arab armies was a statement about, I think, about the future. We're at a point, I believe, that a lot of people realize, I think a lot of people realize, that there is no real, I mean, despite the wild sort of imaginings of people like Maya Kahana, I don't think there is any real Israeli military option against the Palestinians. I mean, I don't think that war of even the most cataclysmic sort in the present set of circumstances, such as perhaps was intended in 1982, is going to achieve the obliteration of the Palestinian people. And I think the opposite is equally true. I mean, I don't think, at least from the point of view of the Palestinians, I don't think there's any real, I mean, there may be rhetoric, there may be even a kind of emotion, but I think the realization that to do away with the Jews who are there in some way, to get rid of them, to send them back to Europe or whatever it is. I mean, it seems to me completely out. Therefore, one of the peculiarities of the current situation is that a great deal of emphasis is then placed upon things like discourse and political and ideological and cultural realms. And it seems to me there is where something like the involvement of more people, you know, in this whole question becomes absolutely crucial, because it seems to me that we, and I'm certainly saying something that many people feel, that the conventional political and military means have been totally unsuccessful in this particular situation. Therefore, other means have to be found. They may be imaginative, they may be discursive exclusively, but I certainly don't think they're military in the conventional sense of the word. I think that realization is beginning to dawn on people, and that maybe a change might be possible there, on the one hand. On the other hand, the depressing aspect of this is that, you know, that in the real world in which we live, military deterrence and holding land and power are real things. I mean, they're not, you know, they're not fictional or emotional or imaginative. And the problem is, how do you use the first thing I was talking about to affect the second? And there, I don't know, maybe film, maybe, you know, maybe irregular or unconventional means of association. All of these things have to be mobilized, because otherwise I see nothing but a rather bleak prospect down the road.
Someone else? Yes.
I have just a question about sort of answering questions. Whenever sort of someone says something, you're faced with the reality that he knows absolutely nothing, and you have to tell him the whole story, as you said before. Now, I find that very frustrating. I usually sort of know so much about it that I don't know where to start. I just wondered if you had some sort of, have you developed a system by one to sort of answer the question in some simple way?
No, you see, that's the problem. There isn't one. I mean, one would like to sort of take out of one's pocket. Yes, I had a relative once who had a card printed up which said, your story is very moving, thank you very much, but I can't contribute, something like that, you know. But so the other side of it, say, here's the story, and if you want to know everything. But there isn't such, because every situation is different, you know. Every challenge with which you're presented requires a different retelling of the story. But I think you have to do it. And start again, and usually pick up on something. I mean, and the most frustrating thing is when there's a response to it. If I might use the example of Cynthia Ozick, since you mentioned her, because I had an exchange with her, a written exchange. About 6 or 7 or maybe 8 years ago, I can't remember what, she wrote, she took the whole issue of the magazine in America called The New Leader, which is not a very well-known magazine. It's a weekly, or it used to be a weekly, in which the title of the whole issue was President Jimmy Carter and the Jews, in which she did a tremendous harangue about how Carter, because of his interest in the Palestinians, et cetera, was essentially anti-Semitic. I mean, I'm boiling down a 40 or 50-page magazine to the message. And in the course of the article, she said, for example, Edward Said, who professes to teach English at Columbia University and is a member, et cetera, regularly is paid to go to Beirut to plot the murder of innocent Israeli children. So I was just, you know, I don't usually respond to that kind of thing, but somebody brought it to my attention. So I sat down and I wrote what I thought was a clever letter, you know, more or less setting the record straight, telling the story, my particular story. I said, you know, my family lives in Beirut, and my way is never paid. I go there on my own to visit my family, and I have no, etc. A series of narrative denials, if you like. Whereupon she wrote a letter back saying, so he pays his own way to go to Beirut.
Next question, please. Is there a next question? Yes, here.
Do you think that there can, in any realistic way, be a call to justice? Is there, as it were, a moral order, a question of justice that is relevant to this question, and that if there is any question of justice, where does the court reside? Where can the case be heard, and where can these questions of justice and morality both be articulated, but how can they bring something to bear on the events? Or, as it were, are they irrelevant? Are they an aside? And what we're really talking about is two conflicting histories that are both real, and in a sense that the only resolution is is through displacements of power, replacements of power, and whether in accommodation or whatever. That is the reality, the realpolitik is the only way that this thing can be expressed.
I don't believe that, Jeff. I mean, I really strongly am convinced that there is justice and there is injustice, and they're really quite different. Now, as to where justice resides, I mean, where objectively one can refer the justice to is in the question of would you like it done to you? I mean, you know, and that's a question that most professed or committed Zionists find it very difficult to respond to, and generally say nothing. And I think, yes, I mean, now, how does one formulate justice? Well, one way is to say, would you like it done to you? And the other way is to say, you know, if you don't see the justice in the injustice, then you're on one side or the other. I mean, it's not a neutral or just a kind of irrelevant thing that you can say, well, sometimes I feel justice, sometimes I feel injustice. I think everyone, I mean, I don't think there's any Archimedean point outside it to which you can go and say, well, I'm outside the whole thing and I can judge equally. Because I think one of the great problems with the Palestinian experience has been that there isn't a sense in which the justice and the truth of our experience has been acknowledged. I mean, has been recognized as such. And if I might go back to that experience in that conference that we were at, it was again very curious. There were 6 Palestinians there, all of whom knew each other, but none of whom really had any frequent contact with them. We were all from different parts of the world. And at one point, one of the Palestinians said, look, to the Israelis, he said, look, what you don't seem to understand, you're sitting back and you say, well, you know, realpolitik is what they were talking. They're all political scientists. I mean, the Israelis, at least, and some of the Palestinians, but it got off the ground at this moment. He said, look, what you don't understand is that I'm from Haifa. You know, I left there my family left in 1948. I don't really want my house back. I mean, I can tell you that. But what I want from you is a sign that you did wrong to me. And there was a lot of fudging and so on and so forth. But in a curious sort of way, we all felt that. In other words, that there was the need for an acknowledgement, an act perhaps even of atonement of some sort. Because part of the curious thing about the Palestinian experience, unlike other colonial experiences, I mean, since I think it is a colonial experience, is that it wasn't that we were exploited, it was that we were excluded. I mean, I feel very strongly about that. Because it seems to me the absolute essence of the whole thing is that for all the experiences suffered by the Jews in Europe, there was still, to my mind, anyway, to my way of interpreting it, the willful transporting of that history to Palestine and the dispossessing and dislocating and displacement of another people in the process. It seems to me, I mean, you could say, well, it was inevitable, there was no other solution, etc. There were people who saw it in different ways amongst the Jewish community, who thought that it was an injustice. Not many, as there are now, like Chomsky and others. But I think at bottom, yes, I would hold very strongly to the idea of justice versus injustice, and not justice or two rights, etc., all of those classical, in my opinion, liberal claims, which are satisfying on one level, but I mean, it doesn't help me very much to be told, well, it's the tragedy of right versus right, I mean, which is the formula that is frequently used. I think there is really a profound, irreducible injustice on one side, and the need for that side to get acknowledgement of that fact in some institutional way.
Is there another question? Yes, this question.
Yes, granted that there is this feeling of injustice, which Professor Said stated already, that existed among the Jews even from before the creation of Israel, would you say that this recognition is now more evident or less so? In fact, the signs from within Israel are the opposite. Perhaps in America it's different, perhaps in the West it's different, but in Israel itself this tendency seems to be in the other direction. Now
what do you mean by the other direction?
The less and less people are willing to recognize this sense of grievance and give it due credit. Why is that, and how does your idea of further communication, further whatever...
Well, you're right. I think, and maybe it's because I live in the United States, which is a crazy country in many ways. I think a lot of it has to do with the United States. I mean, there's no question in my mind that the influence, I mean, that's why I'm as exercised as I am a lot of the time, that this incredible power and this extraordinary munificence that the United States gives to Israel is I mean, the moral equivalent of a kind of a total blank check to do anything at all. I don't think there's any instance of this in history that I've ever encountered. And if you look, for instance, at the recent remarks of leading Jewish figures in America, like, for example, Thomas Dine, who's the head of the APAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, a speech he gave at their annual convention, he more or less says we're the most powerful people in America today. At the drop of a hat, we can get the entire Congress to vote yet more aid for Israel. It's the only, he says, it's the only country in the world in which aid is not tied to specific items. I mean, when India gets wheat, for example, from the United States, it's a specific item, and they have to show, in a sense, receipts for it. They got the money for the wheat. In the case of Israel, it's budgetary support directly to the Israeli economy. There's nothing like it in history, he says. And this attitude, it seems to me, is the great, in my opinion, is the great problem. I mean, it sort of settles a cloud on the whole thing and makes it very hard in the United States, where I think so much of the distortions in my thinking come from. It makes it very difficult to change that. But you'd be surprised. I mean, there's an emerging sense, some polls that have been taken, of changes of opinion. When people begin to find out and are appealed to in a simple and direct way, they say, yes, I mean, we understand that there is a Palestinian, this, that, and the other thing. But how it's going to change, I'm not a political scientist, nor do I have visions of any neat solution. But I think one has to be sensitive and register those changes, and then assess them as time goes on. But it's a long movement. I mean, I think there's a greater fragmentation. I mean, a lot of contacts that were maintained. You see it in the United States amongst Palestinians, where organizations, affiliations, associations of Palestinians are beginning to sort of fall apart. In many ways, it's reflected in the fate of Arafat himself, who I think is a tragic and fascinating figure. You know, we didn't talk about him, because I think he's a very paradoxical person in my view, and fantastically complex. In other words, he has certain very simple aspects, you know, that he's able on a, I mean, he, obviously in the Western or American context, he looks like a mass murderer. I mean, he looks like somebody to whom you'd say, how did you feel after murdering, you know, 5,000 innocent people this morning before breakfast, kind of thing, because of the glasses and the shave, you know, the absence. But in many ways, he's a very, very, very rich figure because of his ability somehow to survive, which is central, of course, to the Palestinian experience, that you just keep going on and on and on, repetition again. And there's a kind of persistence in a political objective, you know. I mean, he has stood for something, which is that the Palestinians should be represented everywhere and should be allowed to represent themselves. That's the one thing he's never sort of backed down on, even though he did a little thing with Jordan, which never worked, etc. But his fate, in many ways, is, I think, the fate of is reflected in the fate of many Palestinian intellectuals and the younger generation. That is to say, what happens to him is a very important index of what's going to happen to the rest of us.
So there's your question, I think so.
Do you see any concrete basis for any sort of formula for some sort of solidarity between what I see as the Jewish victims of Zionism as well as the Arab victims of Zionism, in the sense that it's well known that there's a lot of racism within Israel against Jews themselves, depending on their racial origins. And also I see being like a lot of other countries, having social classes. There are Jews who are exploited by other Jews. You see that sort of thing as being a basis, some sort of solidarity. And also, I have another sort of different, separate question about, I've heard the idea of self-determination for Palestinians, which seems, I can't understand that too well in the sense that there are people that are so badly dispersed at this point. If you have a situation like, for example, Ireland, where you have a place where a lot of Irish people still are, I can see it in that sort of context. But what does that mean in a place like Palestine or Israel, where they're scattered on a wide basis like that?
Well, look, I tell you, I really don't want to answer the first question in a sense, because it's exactly the kind of thing I have sort of given up. I don't want to speak in terms of formulas of that sort, which I distrust. In other words, the oppressed should unite, and I mean, I don't know the experience of the so-called Oriental Jew, for example, inside Israel at first hand. And I think there must be ways in which there are connections between them and Palestinians. But you know, it's something that is very removed from my experience. And I don't want to talk about it theoretically or generally as a political analyst or as a kind of ideologue, because that's not really what I think I'm doing. So I'll use the occasion, therefore, not to answer that question, because I really don't know any more than probably you do, probably less even. As for the other business, I think, you know, most Palestinians speak in terms, not so much, I mean, self-determination is, of course, an English expression. I mean, it's in English. And it never really has sat very well upon the tongue of an Arabic speaker. I mean, its Arabic equivalent is not really part of our vocabulary. Most Palestinians speak of auda, which means return of some sort. But I prefer to use it as a kind of metaphorical concept. But, I mean, you can choose the form of your return. Some people actually, presumably, want to go back. Some never want to go back. But people want to be given the right, however, to express their form of attachment to Palestine in whatever way, as a community, they feel entitled to. And that's precisely what's been denied us. And if I might just say one last thing on a kind of political level, which is fascinating, because, I mean, this is not observation of mine, but it's quite unique, I think, in the history of colonial peoples, such as the Palestinians, I mean, in the Third World, that the one strand that runs through our history is not only the denial of all of this, but somehow the refusal to grant us the right to represent ourselves, which is it's a very interesting, persisting strand. That you know, when they first came in 1926 to this country, the leaders of the Palestinian community, one of the first things that the colonial secretary, Churchill at the time, told them is, who do you represent? I mean, we don't think of you as representatives. There's always this question of representation, and who represents the Palestinians, and do they have the right to represent themselves? I mean, that's been, and I think that's, you know, a terribly important kind of symbolic thing in all of this. And I think Auda is one formula for expressing the right to represent yourself.
Okay, well then, I think, Edward, it remains only to thank you very much for speaking so fluently and at such length when you're already tired. And thank you all, and that's it.
Thank you.